You know, it is pretty wild to think about. How exactly does 3 pounds of wet electrical meat inside our skulls actually learn to think, to feel, to experience the universe? It's literally one of the oldest, most profound mysteries of human existence. But according to author and researcher William Sanchez, the way we're trying to solve this mystery, well, it's become a bit of a battleground. In his writings, Sanchez takes a really provocative stance. He argues that science, specifically evolutionary psychology and neuroscience, already holds the foundational answers to consciousness. Meanwhile, he thinks pure modern philosophy of mind has, frankly, lost its way, getting completely bogged down by abstract thought experiments that distract from biological reality. So, in this explainer, we are going to unpack Sanchez's viewpoint and see exactly how he builds this fascinating case.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for the explainer. We'll cover science versus pure philosophy, evolution of the mind, the mechanics of emergence, rebutting famous thought experiments, the problem with panpsychism, and finally, animal sentience and ethics.
Section 1. Science versus pure philosophy. Redefining the hard problem. Let's look at the core clash at the heart of Sanchez's perspective. Right off the bat, Sanchez basically draws this sharp line in the sand between two totally different approaches to studying the mind. On one side, you have the scientific approach, which he heavily champions. This relies on fields like evolutionary psychology and neuroscience to study consciousness as a physical, biological reality, something deeply rooted in unguided evolution. Then, on the other side, he critiques what he sees as the modern philosophical approach. According to Sanchez, modern philosophy of mind relies way too heavily on abstract thought experiments. He argues it tries to establish these non-empirical rules that artificially restrict what science is even allowed to study, completely ignoring the massive, real-world strides we've made in understanding actual brain anatomy.
Now, you might be wondering about the famous hard problem of consciousness. Philosophers love to argue that there's this unbridgeable explanatory gap between physical brain processes and the actual subjective feeling of being alive. But Sanchez, he argues this is just a massive misinterpretation. He says it is absolutely not an explanatory failure, it's an experiential gap. Think about a hurricane. A meteorologist can perfectly explain the physics of a hurricane, right? But studying those physics is categorically different from standing out in the wind and experiencing it yourself. Sanchez argues science can perfectly explain the mechanics of consciousness, even if studying it from the outside will never ever feel the same as experiencing it from the inside.
Section 2. Evolution of the mind, from matter to mind. If consciousness is a biological reality, where did it come from?
Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds, because Sanchez, who is heavily influenced by Darwin, maps out consciousness as this incredibly gradual biological development. It all starts way back with abiogenesis, the very first life forms simply creating a boundary between what's internal and what's external. Fast forward over 1 billion years, and we start seeing the first diffuse nervous systems. Basically, this allowed organisms, like early worms, to just detect basic light or recoil from harm. Then, about 500 million years ago, a massive shift occurs. Centralized nervous systems evolve. This pulled all those scattered sensory inputs into one unified processing center. And finally, that brings us to the modern era, where complex brains, like ours, use huge amounts of biological energy to run these highly detailed mental simulations.
And this evolutionary timeline leads us to a really fascinating concept called the Umwelt. Sanchez emphasizes that our consciousness is not, I repeat, is not some perfect objective window into fundamental reality. Instead, it's an evolved interface. For example, a dog's Umwelt is prioritized all around rich, complex olfactory smells. A bat's Umwelt, that's built around high-frequency echolocation. Our human consciousness, the very experience you're having listening to me right now, is simply the specific, tailored interface that natural selection built just to help our primate ancestors survive in their specific environment.
Section 3. The mechanics of emergence, generating reality. We know the history, but how does the brain actually pull this off today?
To bridge that gap between physical biology and mental experience, Sanchez leans on a widespread scientific concept: emergence. Emergence happens when a really complex system generates novel properties that simply don't exist in the individual pieces themselves. Like, you are never going to find the property of wetness in a single isolated hydrogen or oxygen atom. But put them together in a massive complex system and boom, the wetness of water emerges. Or, you won't find a flock by dissecting a single bird, but get them flying together and a flock emerges. Sanchez argues that consciousness emerges from the complex firing of billions of neurons in exactly the same way. And this brilliantly illustrates his point. Think about a video game. If you literally tear apart a PlayStation console and a game disc, you are never going to find the blowing grass, the wild horses, or the interactive world of Red Dead Redemption 2 hiding inside the plastic and the wiring. There's no way. The console is just the physical substrate, but when you power it up, it generates an emergent property, the virtual world. Sanchez argues that our nervous system is our physical substrate. Our body expends biological energy to power it, and the emergent property? That's the conscious mental simulation we experience every single second of our lives.
Section 4. Rebutting famous thought experiments. Let's look at how Sanchez deconstructs the philosophy that disagrees with him. Because not everyone buys this physicalist model, right? Philosophers have designed some pretty elaborate thought experiments to try and disprove it. Let's look at arguably the most famous one, Mary's room. Imagine a brilliant scientist named Mary. She's either colorblind or she's been raised her entire life in a black and white room. Now, she studies the science of vision completely. She knows every single physical fact, every wavelength, every neurological trigger associated with the color red. But one day, she steps outside and actually sees the color red for the very first time. The philosophical question is, did she learn something new? The argument claims that if she did learn something new, then physical science failed to give her all the facts, which must mean consciousness is non-physical.
Well, Sanchez's rebuttal here is super straightforward. He says, yes, of course she learned something new. But, and this is absolutely crucial, that is not a failure of science. Remember that experiential gap we talked about a few minutes ago? Sanchez points out that knowing the physical facts of a process is categorically different from undergoing the process yourself. I mean, you can study every single biological fact about digestion, or, say, pregnancy, but that obviously doesn't mean you've experienced them. Science described the visual process perfectly for Mary. She simply, finally, underwent the biological process herself. He takes that exact same sledgehammer to the philosophical zombie argument. This is another thought experiment that asks us to imagine an exact physical replicate of a human being that acts and talks normally, but has zero inner consciousness. The whole point is to prove consciousness isn't physically necessary. Sanchez harshly dismisses the entire concept. He argues that philosophical zombies are just biologically impossible in nature. He says the thought experiment imposes these arbitrary, made-up rules on unguided natural evolution, and it completely ignores the inextricable correlations we actually see every day in hospitals between nervous system damage and the direct loss of consciousness.
Section 5. The problem with panpsychism. Let's look at one of the competing theories gaining a lot of traction. So panpsychism, which is championed by philosophers like Philip Goff, proposes that consciousness is actually a fundamental, ubiquitous feature of the physical universe, meaning even basic particles might have some rudimentary form of consciousness. Now, Sanchez reports deep frustration with how panpsychists argue for this. He claims they rely on a massive straw man argument. They falsely tell the public that Galileo explicitly designed the scientific method to exclude the study of consciousness, creating this sort of artificial vacuum that panpsychism then needs to swoop in and fill. But Sanchez points to centuries of actual scientific study, from Darwin to modern neuroscience, as absolute proof that science has in fact always been studying consciousness.
But beyond just the historical framing, Sanchez details why he believes panpsychism fails fundamentally as a scientific hypothesis. A lot of this comes down to what's called the combination problem. Think about it. Even if particles are conscious, panpsychism totally lacks any explanation for how billions of distinct, tiny conscious particles somehow combine to form the singular unified subjective experience you and I are having right now. Plus, it provides zero mechanism for how this supposed fundamental consciousness interacts with actual brainwaves or neural correlates. Ultimately, Sanchez argues that panpsychism starts with a metaphysical conviction and tries to work backward, rather than doing what science does, building an explanation upward from hard empirical biological data.
Finally, Section 6, Animal Sentience and Ethics. Let's step away from the abstract theories and ground this theory in reality.
Because if consciousness really did evolve gradually over millions of years, it means we are absolutely not alone in our experience. Sanchez highlights landmark scientific consensus to prove this, like the 2012 Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness. I want to read this quote to you directly. Convergent evidence indicates that non-human animals have the neuroanatomical, neurochemical, and neurophysiological substrates of conscious states. This evolutionary view demands that we wake up and recognize that mammals, birds, and even creatures like octopuses actually share the neurological hardware that generates a rich inner life.
So the crucial point is that understanding consciousness isn't just some abstract academic exercise. Sanchez points out that science already relies on subjective reporting every single day. Think about it. When a doctor asks you to rate your pain on a 1 to 10 scale and then actually changes your medication based on your answer, that is a scientist using your first-person subjective experience to make real-world decisions. Because we share similar neurological realities, we can understand and treat each other's subjective pain. And according to Sanchez, this exact same scientific logic simply must extend to how we treat the animal kingdom. Which leaves us with this final, truly profound question to consider today. If consciousness isn't magic, and it isn't some fundamental particle floating in the universe, but is instead a grounded, evolved biological reality that we share with the wider animal kingdom, where exactly do we draw the line on sentience and ethical treatment? By framing consciousness through the lens of evolutionary biology, rather than pure philosophy, William Sanchez challenges us not just to rethink how our own minds work, but how we treat the millions of other minds currently sharing our planet. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the world around you.